Hello, everyone. My name's Eddie Smith here with Matt Conley. We're doing another podcast, showing our faces today for once. But how you doing, Matt?
I'm doing terrific. How are you doing, Eddie?
I'm doing great. Today we're going to talk about policing in the United States, the origins of this. Going to kind of give it a Marxist analysis as we always do. I'll kind of talk about the theoretical side, and then Matt will talk about the concrete research that he's done that'll help you get a better picture of how policing in this country has evolved and how it currently exists today. So yeah, so how Marx and Lenin saw the police are an apparatus, an armed body of the state which exists above society, which acts as a tool of suppression for the ruling class by the subordinate class. So it enforces the mode of production, meaning under capitalism, if you went and tried to seize the means of production at your workplace today, the police would come and stop you and throw you in jail. Under slavery, if you tried to run away, theoretically, once, police hadn't really developed historically at the time of slavery, they would later, as Matt's going to talk about. But it's an armed body that enforces the mode of production. Under feudalism, you could kind of consider police whoever had the weapons, right? They would enforce that the serfs work all day, and they have a monopoly on violence, meaning they're the only body allowed to use violence legally, as we have seen a lot in the U.S. With police getting off scot-free for killing, and they exist above society. That's what that badge does, right? The police has special powers in society given to him by society that allow him to exist above society and enforce whatever the laws are, which we know are laws generally created by capitalists. So yeah, Matt, let's talk about the history of how police came to be in the U.S.
So the history of policing in America has been around since about the 1600s. The police in America used to be a private organization, which was privately funded, but these organizations were so inept that they had to be disbanded. The first publicly funded police organization was founded in 1838 in Boston. Boston was a big port, had a huge shipping industry, and the wealthy merchants who were facilitating the shipping in Boston had hired private individuals to protect their capital, their port, and their shipping containers and stuff like that. But this was not very effective. It was costing the merchants a lot of money. So instead, the merchants lobbied the government of Boston to create a publicly funded police force. This was the first publicly funded police force, as I mentioned earlier. And the sole purpose of this police force was to protect the interests of capital and protect the interests of these wealthy merchants. In the South, the police was formed in the 1830s as well, specifically on the basis of white supremacy. So we have in the South the formation of slave patrols. That was literally the first institution of policing in the South, was to catch runaway slaves. So now we see immediately in the policing in the South the institution of white supremacy. We still see that today. We still see huge aspects of white supremacy in the policing today. We see that throughout the evolution. So from 1830s on, we see police continuously trying to put down, whether it's the suffrage movement, women trying to gain more rights, police violently putting down women, police during the civil rights movement spraying African Americans with hoses and unleashing dogs on them to stop them from protesting for equal rights. Like we see throughout history, the police constantly being an agitator against progress and protecting capital.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reading a book called The Half Has Never Been Told right now, which is a history of the development of capitalism in the U.S., which of course in the South was built on slavery, but in the South you had the slavery mode of production, meaning slaves did the labor, coexisting with the capitalist mode of production, meaning wage slaves do the labor, or wage laborers, which was what existed in England and what existed in the North. And it's so interesting that the formation of police in both areas took place around the protection of the specific mode of production. In the South, the police were formed to catch the runaway slaves and make sure that the capitalists in the South, or the slave owners in the South, had enough labor. In the North, same thing, to protect their ports and to protect their capital, which just shows that police are an institution founded on just that, for the protection of capital, and that's what they've been, and as you said, that's what they've evolved into. But honestly, I think the libertarians have it right. If we would have just kept the police private, none of this would ever happen. Nothing would ever gone wrong. I'm just kidding. Could you imagine what would happen today if the police were privatized? How fast, like, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk would form private police forces to just do whatever they want. but Matt's right, and going back into the Marxist philosophy and the Marxist analysis of it, these are armed bodies which exist above the state and enforce the mode of production. But they've evolved, and as leaders like Fred Hampton and others have risen up to try and fight against the mode of production and argue for moving towards a new one, it's the police who kill them. Fred Hampton specifically was killed by the Chicago police, and you can think of other armed bodies of the state as doing similar things. Particularly the FBI is one who works domestically. I think FBI was traced to the killing of both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and obviously we know what the CIA does abroad. Obviously, again, the same concept there: suppression of the working class, the working masses, for the enforcement of the current mode of production and the current ruling class in our mode of production, which is the capitalists, and that's what they're formed on. And there's been an invention of the capitalists, and now that there's deep collaboration between the wealthiest in society and the state, as Matt said, this body of the state, the police, is supposedly a public institution, but it's formed for the protection of capital, right? It's always backing the capitalists. And in the 1970s, you start to see the formation of the prison industrial complex coinciding with the war on drugs, meaning cops are now forced to go into low-income neighborhoods and throw people in jail for nonviolent drug offenses. And of course, throughout our history in the U.S., it has been racist, which, big surprise considering when you look back at what the institution was founded on, literally white supremacy and chasing down slaves, that you see a reformulation of the police in the 1970s start to be, an armed body of the state who are throwing black and brown people in jail for nonviolent offenses. And the prison industrial complex makes insane amounts of money. Telecommunications company, every time prisoners have to make a call. The food companies who sell food, I think it's Aramark, the same company who works for our college, make tons of money off this, plus just cash bail that prisoners have to pay, the amount of money that comes in from that, not to mention the fact that there are literally privately owned prisons who directly make money from it. And this is all incentive for things we see like the war on drugs, and it's why you see the BLM movement and other opposition movements form in response to the police. Yeah. You want to talk about specifically the police in Iowa now?
Well, yeah, but before we get to that, I kind of wanted to touch back on what you were saying about the war on drugs in the 1970s. So that was literally founded with a racist basis. So that was founded under the Nixon administration, and one of his top advisors, John Ehrlichman, has a very famous quote. He says basically, we were against the civil rights movement, and we were against the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, but they knew they couldn't criminalize protest because that's against the free speech. So they got the public to associate African Americans with marijuana, or the hippies with marijuana, and African Americans with crack cocaine, and then they criminalized those extra hard, went into those communities, and arrested those people. So that just kind of shows the white supremacy, again, baked into the system of policing in America.
As the CIA was transporting crack cocaine to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, who were right-wing paramilitary death squads putting down the Sandinistas, the CIA helped facilitate the sale of crack into black and brown neighborhoods, while the police threw black people in jail, making the prison industrial complex rich, and the Sandinistas and Nicaraguans were fighting for their lives against these right-wing death squads. Yeah.
And then with that, so because of the disproportionate amount of African American and black and brown people in prison doing slave labor, as you said, so a lot of people think that slavery has been abolished in America since 1863 or 1865, but that's not true. The 13th Amendment says that slavery is abolished except as a form of punishment. So people in prison right now are performing slave labor, as you said, because for these companies. And again, because of the disproportionate amount of people of color in prison, it's just basically reaffirming white supremacy and slavery into a system of policing.
Yeah, it's just a reformulation of the older system, and even after you see the abolition of slavery legally, you see that provision is written into the 13th Amendment unless you're arrested. And you immediately see these police who were formed just to catch runaway slaves start arresting slaves for loitering, right? Just for standing around, and then they're in jail, and then you can make them slaves again. And that persisted in the South forever until, eventually that was cracked down on, and then you see the formation of terror groups in the Ku Klux Klan. But yeah, I mean, of course, this is what the police have evolved into, and but this history of the police is never taught, right? You're not showed the movie 13th in school. You're taught that racism ended back in the day. So yeah, so let's talk about, since Matt obviously has considered running for office in Iowa, and we live in Iowa. He's got some statistics specific to Iowa, which were mind blowing to me. But yeah, you want to talk about those?
Yeah. So to start off with, Iowa's prison population is larger than the next 11 developed countries in the world. So Iowa's prison population is about 528 people per 100,000. That's higher than the UK, Canada, Portugal, Spain, I think. A huge list of countries. Iowa's only second to the United States of America, which has a higher amount. In Iowa, Black people make up 4% of the population, but almost 26% of the prison population. And half of those people are in there for drug-related crimes. So 50% of African Americans in prison right now, so about 12% of the total prison population are in there for drug-related crimes. We also have the number of African American, or the chance that an African American person gets locked up in Iowa is 11 times higher than that of whites. If that's not systemic racism, if that's not a systemic problem built into the issue of policing, please tell me what else it can possibly be.
Yeah, and living in Iowa, I've seen it firsthand, and obviously this is why it's important to listen to the lived experiences of people of color, because when you've lived something or seen it, it sets in different. Obviously, we don't use anecdotal evidence maybe when we're arguing or writing papers or addressing the solutions, but I drove my girlfriend's little red car around for 2 months. Me and her, my white girlfriend, drove it around for 2 months, and I guess the plates were expired. And we loaned the car to my black roommate once, and he got pulled over. Just stuff like that. And where you see it, it's impossible to deny. The same kid, our neighbor called him the N-word once randomly because he was playing music that she didn't like. So, yeah, you see it firsthand. It's disgusting. It's horrible, and it's a remnant that's been around in this society for so long, and the key is to fight it, to resist it, and which is what BLM has been trying to do. So let's talk about some of the solutions that we want to advocate for, especially with Matt hoping to eventually gain political office of some sort, the kind of stuff he would fight for, and the kind of stuff we advocate for that can attack this problem at the root.
Mm-hmm. So first and foremost, I think we need to defund the police and reallocate some of the funding that police get into social services. That's what I think the phrase defund the police means. And oftentimes police show up after a crime has been committed. So police do not often stop a crime in the middle of the act. Instead, they show up after the fact. And so why are people so focused on either refunding the police, increasing their funding, or even just keeping it at the same level? Why are we so focused on solving the symptoms instead of the root causes of the problem? Why don't we try to limit crime in its entirety rather than stopping crime after the fact? So there's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that poverty increases the likelihood that you'll commit a crime. And so if we improve people's material conditions, if we have a jobs guarantee, if we give everybody health care, if we give people access to better education, free college, more opportunities essentially, and improve their material conditions, they will be less likely to commit a crime. Will crime still be in existence? Yes, it will. And so at least mine and Eddie's position are we need some sort of police force, but we also think that it should be smaller, and we should be addressing and focusing on the root causes rather than after the fact.
Yeah, and demilitarized. The police are entirely militarized. And we talk about not being able to solve the root causes, but the root cause is capitalism, right? The root cause is that people are profiting off the prison industrial complex, and those same people are lobbying the government to make sure that the police are militarized, and the police have to constantly keep the prisons full of warm bodies to do $1 an hour or less labor, and continue paying telecom companies $10 for a 1 hour, 10-minute phone call or whatever, right? The capitalists and the government who are bought by the capitalists do not want to address the root causes. When you hear Matt talk about this stuff, let's stop giving police machine guns and militarizing them, and stop invading countries overseas, and stop making police focus on nonviolent drug offenses, and instead treat these people and put all this money into education. Of course, this is common sense. You would have to be a complete lunatic to not think that investing in education and social work and rehab is better for a society than throwing people into slavery camps, of course. But the people in power are profiting off the slavery camps, and that's concealed by capitalism, right? They tell you, oh, this is just the way things are. We just have to fight racism as best we can and hope the cops will eventually be nicer. No, the cops were founded on white supremacy and the protection of private property, and until we abolish that at the root and completely eradicate, as Lenin would say, shatter the armed body of the police as they currently exist, so we can create an apparatus or a body that actually provides protection and actually helps people, which is what the purpose of a public safety body is supposed to be, whether you're talking about the police or the firefighters, whatever it is. Firefighters actually function pretty well, the fire station, but they used to be private as well, and they didn't function as well. But yeah, I mean, the root cause of the problem is capitalism, and that's why the people in power won't do anything about it, and that's why the answer is, socialism, or, taking the policing industry and the prison industry and making those giant corporations public, right? Not necessarily saying we want government control of everything, but we don't want a government that's bought by the capitalists, and the capitalists are using that to put people in jail for nonviolent offenses, and that's what we're going to fight for.
Mm-hmm. And kind of going off of what you were saying about demilitarizing, one very vivid example of this, and again, this is just anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt, but last year in Kenosha, Wisconsin, so 3 hours from where we are right now, after Jacob Blake got shot in the back 7 times for trying to get into his car, which that in and of itself shows the horrible nature and the lack of training around police. But during the protests after the fact, I remember seeing the police in these huge trucks that they were gifted by the U.S. military after the U.S. military was done using them. So the Kenosha Police Department was driving around in these military-grade vehicles trying to stop the protesters. They even stopped and gave the Proud Boys, a white supremacist militia group, waters, and said, thank you guys for your help, in these big military trucks. So again, anecdotal, but that just shows both the collaboration with white supremacists that the police are often involved in, and the over-militarization of the police force in putting down peaceful protests.
Dang. Yeah, that's an anecdotal story, but there are stats to back up that the police as an occupation specifically are attracting a certain kind of people. What is it? Is it 20? I think it's over 20% of police have been arrested for domestic abuse. Not to say, all cops are horrible people, but the term ACAB, all cops are bad, means the institution itself is terrible and corrupt and rotten. So if you choose to be a cop, that means you're being bad. That's what that means, which is, true.
Yeah, and I don't know the number for the 2020 election, but 84% of cops voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. So, I mean, they're just overtly, again, the institution itself, the people within the institution are overtly supporting people who are doing racist agitprop. They're supporting, some sort of white nationalist president. And again, it's just kind of a problem with the whole institution. Another one of the solutions that Eddie and I are thinking is really important is the decriminalization of all drugs and the legalization of marijuana. So as I mentioned before, a quarter of people in Iowa's prisons right now are in there for drug-related offenses. I don't think that putting somebody in jail for a drug crime is the solution. We should instead treat drug addiction like the mental health crisis it is, and have services available for people to go into and get help that they need. I know in Portugal, in 2001, they decriminalized all drugs, and there was a huge panic that this would cause drug use to increase and the country would just run rampant with drugs. Instead, it has been one of the greatest success stories surrounding drug decriminalization. There are overdose deaths and overdose that haven't resulted in deaths, especially when considering opioids and heroin. Those have all decreased. Drug use has decreased in the aggregate, so it has done the opposite of what conservative politicians in Portugal were warning about. And this is because Portugal set up what they call safe use sites, so people can go into these facilities and use their drugs that they're going to use anyway in a safe, monitored situation. Now, it does seem kind of counterintuitive, but the idea behind it is if they, again, are going to use it anyway, they might as well have a clean needle and have supervision so that they do not overdose and they get the proper amount. At the same time, at these safe site or safe use zones, they will have a person come up to them and say, hey, we can help you curb your drug addiction. Let us help you. And again, more people do that, and that is why we see a decrease in drug use in Portugal since 20 years ago.
Yes, decriminalization is huge. Another big one is the abolishing private prisons. Private prisons, there's not a ton of them. It's a lot of public prisons just allow private corporations to make a ton of money, which is why obviously we're talking about the root cause of this being capitalism, and these telecom giants and others who are making money off the prison industrial complex should be nationalized or at least heavily regulated as well. But private prisons need to be abolished. How is that allowed to exist? How are we allowed to have people, capitalists, sitting on top of prisons making money, the more people who are in there who then use that money to lobby the government? Completely ridiculous. Take all the money that's spent on public prisons and invest it in a jobs guarantee. A jobs guarantee helps so much in this country. Any socialist president or presidential candidate or candidate for office should be talking about a jobs guarantee to stop unemployment, to get Republicans to stop complaining about people not going to work and sitting on unemployment checks, which isn't true. There have been studies done on it. People are working, but a jobs guarantee would help everyone work, and then it would give people an opportunity when they get out of prison, right? What's one of the major problems when people get out? It's something like 70% end up going back to prison because the system's not based on rehabilitation, and it's really hard to find a job with a private corporation when you've got a criminal record. So a jobs guarantee also allows those people coming out of prison to be rehabilitated and to get themselves a good paying job that can give them dignity and a life after prison. So yeah, you got anything else, Matt, or should we call it there? I think we covered it.
I think we covered it all.
Nice.
Feeling pretty good about this one.
Yes, me too. We covered it all. This topic is done. Give it up, academia. Matt and Eddie just put it to a conclusive finish. All right. Peace out, everyone.
Thanks for watching.
Solidarity.